I will start now. Good afternoon. My name is Tarandi Panu, and I am the Strategic plus EDI plus Accessibility Communication Specialist at the CERC in Health Equity and Community Wellbeing at Toronto Metropolitan University. Today's event will be recorded and available to view on our website later next year. Thank you for joining us today for our speaker series. I would like to start off with our sincere apologies and regrets from Dr. Ravi Malhotra, who is unable to join us today due to some unforeseen circumstances. However, today's speaker series will still focus on disability in the workplace and will feature a public lecture from Emily Ruppel, PhD candidate in sociology at U Berkeley, on capitalizing disability, labor processes, and governance in disability employment programs. Today's event is virtual, with audiences joining from all around the world. Live captioning is provided for those online. Please select the CC button on your Zoom menu bar in order to see the captions. Before we start the event, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land that we are currently on is part of the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected with the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, an agreement to peacefully share and care for resources around the Great Lakes. I come to this land as a child of immigrants who found safety in a home here, which allowed them to grow and settle. I am grateful for the opportunity to work on this land and call it my home, and by doing so, I give my respect to its first inhabitants, while also acknowledging that the rights and privileges afforded through immigration and through my birth in this country have given me benefits that many Indigenous nations do not have. This acknowledgement is not to belittle any other form of marginalization we all experience, but to understand and bring attention to the fact that when we, as cultural practitioners, speak of and on issues around race, immigration, gender, disability, and socioeconomic status, that it should not be siloed from talking about the action against the vast issues faced by Indigenous folks in Canada and around the globe. I encourage you all to seek ways towards positive reconciliation and the navigating of your relationship with this land as current settlers. Emily is joining us from Southern California, where she lives on the traditional and unceded territories of the Chumash people. Much of this research was performed at the University of California, Berkeley, on the unceded territories of the Ohlone people, to whom Emily pays annual Shumi land taxes. Voluntary land taxes are a way to recognize our access to stolen Indigenous land. For more information about voluntary land taxes and if they are available where you live, please go to nativegov.org. Now, a little bit about the CERC in Health Equity and Community Wellbeing. We are a transformative research initiative that employs an engaged community participant approach to expand our understanding, practice, and delivery of health outcomes for all members of our communities. Through collaboration with a network of healthcare institutions, service providers, and civil society organizations, the program aims for a paradigm shift, one that challenges a siloed, expert-driven approach to health and well-being and moves instead towards a community-engaged, preventative model of well-being. Uniquely applying critical disability lens, the research program aims to not only reduce health disparities that are inextricable from their social context, but to embed community knowledge into healthcare institutions, systems, and models of delivery. Now to start our event, I'm thrilled to introduce our guest, Emily Ruppel, who is a PhD candidate in sociology at University of California, Berkeley. She is interested in the connections between political economic transformations, embodied identities, particularly gender, sexuality, and disability. She investigates these themes through 3 linked research programs on disability as an ongoing principle of labor, on health in social contexts, and on gender and sexuality. Her dissertation focuses empirically on job training, programs for disabled workers using historical research to trace the growth of this industry since the 1970s, and ethnographic fieldwork to investigate contemporary labor practices. She has published 12 peer-reviewed articles in journals including American Sociology Review, Working Occupations, Journal of Health and Social Behavior, Social Sciences and Medicine, Economy and Society, and Sexualities. I am pleased to welcome Emily here with us today. Thank you, Emily.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction and for having me. I'm gonna try to share my screen now, and hopefully you'll all be able to see it. Okay. Are people seeing my slides successfully?
Yes, yes, we can see.
Just my slides? Okay, great. Um, Thank you so much for that introduction. As Tarndeep shared, I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at UC Berkeley. Today, I'm going to discuss my dissertation research on recent efforts to make disability profitable. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here and really appreciate you having me. So I know I'm preaching to the choir with this audience, but I want to begin by underscoring why we study disability. As many of you likely know, the orienting framework of disability studies as an interdisciplinary field is the social model of disability, which distinguishes between impairment and disability, defining impairment as natural bodily or mental variation, and disability as the stigma attached to this variation. For instance, some people can't hear. That's what disability theorists call impairment. In the contemporary United States, deafness is a disability, but in a hypothetical society where people use sign language exclusively, it wouldn't be. By highlighting disability as socially constructed, the social model of disability touches on a lot of critical themes for social scientists, like stigma, inequality, and the social construction of categories. However, much disability research focuses on interpersonal and architectural barriers to disability rights and neglects the political economic context of disability stigma. But disability raises a question critical to capitalism. What do we do with people who can't work, at least under the conditions that they're expected to? Because universal wage labor is so fundamental to capitalism as a mode of production, disability forces us to think through the contradictions of capitalism. What happens to people whose chronic fatigue prevents them from working a 40-hour week, or who can't hear or speak to communicate with managers, or who can't process information quickly enough to meet the demands of most jobs? In my research, I theorize disability as a site where the imperatives of capitalism meet the limits of the body. And the mind is part of the body. We know this from decades of criticism of mind-body dualism. So I'm including mental disability in that definition. So I study disability not just because disabled people's lives are important in and of themselves, though they are, but because disability can tell us important things about capitalism. I propose that we've seen two major shifts in the social category of disability, which correspond to shifts in the organization of labor. Historical research shows that in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, disability emerged as a new social category defined by exclusion from wage labor. Impairments, including difficulty walking, speaking, seeing, etc., were less stigmatized in pre-capitalist societies, but they began to be classified as disabilities as new industrial workplaces rejected workers with these impairments, and more broadly, as wage labor developed into a prerequisite for survival and societal participation. This shift is the subject of fantastic monographs by Sarah Rose, Sue Schweik, and Todd Carmody, among other scholarly work. Throughout this talk, I'm going to discuss disability as a category defined by the inability to work, but I want to be clear that I'm not saying that as a value judgment. I consider the ability to work totally morally neutral, and I'm not weighing in myself on who can or can't work in different kinds of jobs. When I say disability is defined by the inability to work, I'm speaking as a sociologist about the social production of the category, and I'm drawing on this historical literature about how the category first emerged as a way of demarcating populations excluded from wage labor. But over the last few decades, our understandings of disability have changed. A couple of weeks ago, a friend texted me this poster she saw in an airport where she said my project was haunting her. In the United States, starting around 1970, a bipartisan coalition, including disability activists, technocrats, and fiscal conservatives, have pushed for disabled involvement in wage labor. In the US, their most prominent achievement is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which states in its preamble that its goal is to turn people with disabilities from benefits recipients into taxpayers. This coalition has also pushed for lesser-known programs promoting disabled employment, dispersing billions of dollars to job training programs for workers with disabilities, and reforming disability benefits to promote work. Although my research focuses on the United States, we've seen similar policy regimes unfold worldwide. And we've seen public discourse about why these changes are good for business, which argues that disabled people are not just capable of work, but sometimes more capable than their non-disabled peers. Activists and entrepreneurs highlight unique skills that they associate with disability, like the supposed empathy of people with intellectual disabilities or autistic savant skills in math, science, and technology. People with disabilities are our most underutilized workforce, according to this poster. These changes have received attention in the disability press, but they haven't been adequately theorized by social scientists. To the extent that theorists of labor and capitalism engage with disability, they usually presume that people with disabilities are excluded from labor markets and receive state aid as part of the so-called deserving poor. Yet there's a real possibility here that these changes transform disability from a category defined by idleness to a category defined by potential productivity. And I'm sure for many of you, this is setting off alarm bells about exploitation. So that's what my project evaluates: the reconstitution of disability as a source of productivity and profits, and the social consequences of this reconstitution. You can think about my project as an empirical sequel to the monographs I described on the emergence of disability in the transition to capitalism. I trace the evolution of this category through the present day. So in my dissertation, I ask, how has disability evolved as an organizing principle of labor since the 1970s? I address this question through empirical analysis of job training programs for workers with disabilities in the United States, combining historical research on the development of this industry with ethnographic fieldwork in 2 contemporary employment programs. My goal is to develop what I call a materialist theory of disability, linking transformations in disability as a social category to transformations in the system of production. I focus on the disability employment programs industry because this industry is a critical site of the production, maintenance, and deployment of people with disabilities as a labor supply, making the reconstitution of disability visible. Depending on the definition of disability that we use, about 20% of the population has a disability, though some expansive definitions put it higher. We don't have great numbers for the population working in disability employment programs, but government audits of this industry put it on the order of 400,000 people in the United States and many more worldwide. Even though that's a small percentage of the disabled population, it's a pretty big number in objective terms, and more importantly, focusing on this industry gives me analytic leverage on disability as an organizing principle of labor. Specifically, I developed materialist disability theory by comparing 2 leading models of disability employment programming. State-funded disability employment programs date back to the early 20th century, but expanded rapidly between the 1960s and 1980s as disabled people moved from institutions into these employment programs. The figure on the left half of this slide documents the declining population in state institutions in the United States, while the figure on the right half documents employment program growth over the same period. These programs primarily employ workers with mental disabilities, and in some cases, they pay minimum wage under a they pay below minimum wage under a United States law allowing sub-minimum wages to be paid to disabled workers. If you've ever seen headlines about Goodwill paying sub-minimum wages to people with disabilities, that's the program model I'm talking about here. I'm not going to have time to go into the history of these state-backed programs today, but it's detailed in a paper I published this fall in the American Sociological Review, which I'd be happy to share with anyone. The basic story is that state institutions were defunded through pressure from an unlikely coalition of disability activists and fiscal conservatives. But following their closures, legislators refused to replace them with the expensive community living programs envisioned by activists. Instead, legislators promoted the mass transfer of institution residents into disability employment programs, which they saw as in line with workfare principles. I conducted 8 months of ethnographic fieldwork in a state-funded program for people with mental illnesses that I'll call Disability Works in 2019 and 2020. Autism in tech programs represent a more recent corporate innovation. Since the early 2000s, many Fortune 500 software companies and independent contractors in the tech industry have developed hiring programs which treat autistic people as an untapped talent source for a new economy based around technological innovation. The logos on this slide are just a small subset of the companies which advertise their programs publicly. I conducted 11 months of fieldwork in an autism hiring program that I'll call Autacity in 2023 and 2024. Fieldwork across these two programs illuminates how the state matches people with mental illnesses with the precarious service sector jobs which proliferate today, while technology companies draw on stereotypes of autistic people as socially impaired geniuses to match them to low-level tech jobs, in both instances, repackaging disability as profitable. I'm going to focus today on the ethnographic comparison between Disability Works and Autacity, but in my dissertation, I contextualize these two cases through interviews and historical research on the broader disability employment programs industry. These supplementary data support the claim that Disability Works and Autacity are contrasting exemplars of the industry, and that their practices reflect those of other state-backed, service-oriented disability employment programs, in the case of Disability Works, and tech industry autism hiring initiatives, in the case of Autacity. In my broader dissertation, 3 historical chapters investigate how transformations in disability benefits, anti-discrimination legislation, and minimum wage regulations demarcate disabled workers as a stigmatized, available labor force on the fringes of the economy. Versions of 2 of these chapters came out this year in Critical Sociology and the American Sociological Review. Then 4 chapters of comparative ethnographic fieldwork show how the state and private capital put this labor supply to work, with disability employment programs operating as middlemen. 2 papers on my first field site have been published in Work and Occupations and Social Science and Medicine. Today, I'm going to focus on the 2 ethnographic chapters highlighted in red on this slide, using comparison between my 2 field sites to show how the state and capital collaborate to mobilize disability as an organizing principle of labor. Essentially, I'm going to follow the money, comparing how the 2 sites' funding sources shape their organizational practices. Both field sites operate formally as nonprofits, but Disability Works receives nearly all of its funding from the welfare state, whereas Autacity is funded through business relationships with tech companies. However, the 2 organizations' labor practices converge as the contradictory conditions attached to their funding incentivize the placement of client workers in precarious, low-wage positions. So rather than explaining differences between these field sites, today's talk argues that despite their differences, both sites illustrate how structural contradictions of disability as a capitalist category produce disabled workers as a contingent labor force. Investigating 2 extremes of the social production of disabled workers enables the theorization of this phenomenon. The central thesis of my project is that disability is presently defined through the simultaneous inability to work and imperative to work. We understand disability as definitionally connoting the exclusion from wage work, but at the same time, we expect people with disabilities to work, and we establish programming to make that happen. When I say imperative, I'm not just talking about the imperatives that disabled people themselves might feel, but also imperatives on the organizational side, like claims in the tech industry that autistic people have the skills companies need to succeed in the 21st century. This contradiction emerges at a lot of different levels. In my dissertation, I document how it structures disability benefits, how it structures the implementation of anti-discrimination legislation, how it legitimizes the payment of some minimum wages to disabled workers, and how it manifests in our culture. Today, I'm going to focus on the organizational level, showing you how this contradiction shapes practices at my 2 field sites, the welfare state program and the tech company. And I'm going to show you how both organizations place people with disabilities in precarious jobs as a strategy to handle this contradiction, which is part of the broader argument in my dissertation that this core contradiction produces people with disabilities as a labor force suited to the hiring needs of capital. So just to recap, as I said before, the overarching question of my entire dissertation is how disability has evolved as an organizing principle of labor since the 1970s. The research question addressed in today's talk is how the state and private capital mobilize disability as an organizing principle of labor through their economic relationships with disability employment programs, and I investigate that through fieldwork in 2 programs. And to preview the answer, I'm going to show you how, despite the corporate orientation seen at one site and the social welfare orientation seen at the other, the contradictory conditions attached to employment program funding produce disabled workers as a contingent labor force at both sites. Management, staff, and client workers at Disability Works conceptualize the organization as a social services nonprofit implementing the goals of the welfare state. When you walk into Disability Works, you can tell it's a nonprofit shaped by state austerity from the decor circa 1990, the yellowing binders listing state resources, and the cramped offices that caseworkers share 2 or 3 to a room. That's a stock photo, not Disability Works. Disability Works is funded primarily by 2 state agencies, the State Department of Vocational Services, which funds a team of caseworkers to work one-on-one with client workers to place them in jobs, and the local Department of Health, which funds a set of in-house work programs. When I say in-house work programs, I'm talking about teams of client workers who perform work on contracts with other organizations, but their direct employer is Disability Works, and their work environments are segregated by disability. These work programs span industries including janitorial services, clerical work, information technology, and packaging and kit assembly. Most client workers in these work programs are paid minimum wage, and some are paid sub-minimum wages under the law I mentioned earlier. Some client workers in these in-house programs work on-site, undertaking packaging and kit assembly in an on-site warehouse, or tech support in an on-site call center, while others, like janitorial crews, perform work around the city. Most Disability Works staff see themselves as aspiring mental health providers, often working towards graduate degrees in health or social services. Staff refer to client workers with disabilities as clients, correcting anyone who calls them workers, like me, and they characterize the low-wage work performed in Disability Works in-house programs as a social service. This social service orientation produces friction when Disability Works staff try to build relationships with businesses whose language they don't really speak, but it facilitates strong relationships with state funders. Boundaries between the state and Disability Works are blurred to the point that client workers often got confused about whether staff were government employees or not. Managers reported this confusion to me as a compliment given their professional identification with the welfare state. Both staff and client workers are predominantly women of color, reflecting the feminization and racialization of poverty and of welfare provision. By contrast, employees at Audacity conceptualize the organization as a traditional tech company employing a unique population. It looks the part too. Their main office occupies a renovated warehouse with gorgeous exposed brick and beams, huge windows letting in sunlight, and an open plan. Walk around back and you'll find shelves upon shelves of free food and drinks for client workers, and a coffee machine much nicer than the one I have at home. Audacity gets 90% of its operating funds from its contracts with traditional tech companies, through which they're paid to perform technical services tasks, including quality assurance, data entry, automation, and other things that the companies deem inconvenient or expensive to do in-house. Client workers are employed by Audacity, but move from project to project as new projects come in or old ones get wrapped up. Depending on the nature of their projects, some client workers work in person at one of Audacity's 2 offices, some work remotely, and most work a hybrid schedule. In contrast to Disability Works, Audacity was almost entirely white, and the vast majority of autistic client workers were men, though some non-autistic women held managerial and support positions. I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about how the different demographics at Disability Works and Autacity reflect the uneven racialization and gendering of disability categories. Staff at Autacity refer to the organization as a company and refer to autistic client workers as workers or employees. They identify the organization's nonprofit status as primarily a tax loophole. In conversations with one another and with me, many managers and client workers went out of their way to distinguish Autacity from traditional disability employment programs like Disability Works, and to emphasize that they offer real work, not charity. Instead, managers at Autacity draw parallels between themselves and other technology companies, often claiming that they offer wages and benefits on par with these other companies. Though, as I'll get into, that's not true. In spite of these divergent organizational identities, labor practices at Disability Works and Autacity converge due to contradictions produced by their funding structures. I'll show you how these contradictions manifest the fundamental tension in disability between the purported inability and imperative to work, and I'll explain how this fundamental tension produces precarious employment practices at both Disability Works and Autacity. As a welfare state program recruiting client workers already entangled with state assistance, the majority of Disability Works client workers receive benefits including Social Security disability insurance, supplemental security income, and Medicaid. These benefits can be especially important for people with mental illnesses who might go through periods of productivity and other periods of limited capacity. Imagine a person with bipolar disorder who misses work during depressive episodes, or a person with schizophrenia who gets fired after experiencing psychosis on the job. Accessing benefits is an incredibly arduous, years-long process. So once you've won the legal battle to qualify, you really, really don't want to lose your benefits. Disability benefits are designed to support people whose embodied limitations make wage work inaccessible, at least during periods of illness, but their low levels simultaneously make work an imperative. SSI benefits were capped during fieldwork at $783 per month, while SSDI benefits vary, but average $1259 per month. In Disability Works' home city, the median rent for a one-bedroom apartment surpasses $3,000, indicating the insufficiency of benefits for survival. Many client workers told me that they sought employment because they couldn't make ends meet on disability benefits. However, income must be reported to the Social Security Administration, and if monthly earnings exceed set limits, benefits can be reduced or withdrawn altogether. SSI recipients are also prohibited from holding more than $2,000 in savings at any given time. If you've never been on SSI, think about what your life would look like if you could never ever have more than $2,000 on hand. You couldn't go to college, couldn't send your kids to college, couldn't buy a house or put down a security deposit on a new apartment, maybe couldn't even buy a laptop. And these rules are strictly enforced, with many client workers sharing horror stories of cuts to their benefits. Additionally, disabled workers' need for healthcare coverage makes it exceptionally dangerous for them to exceed earnings caps for Medicaid. Josephine, the informant quoted on this slide, was concerned that stable, full-time employment would jeopardize her access to treatment for bipolar disorder. I'll read this quote out now. "If I were to get a regular job, full-time, minimum wage job, my life would be shit because I wouldn't be able to pay for insurance. I wouldn't be able to pay for my drugs. The psychiatrist that I see, without Medicaid, it's like $35,000 a year just for the psychiatrist. There was a medication I was taking. Oh my God, it's like $1,000. Of course it makes you think, oh God, I can't lose this because there's no way I could support that on my own. To qualify for benefits, you have to be so impoverished, but people are not in a position to be able to be that impoverished. People are just sort of caught between not poor enough, but you can't earn enough to support yourself." Returning to the contradiction I introduced at the start of this talk, earnings and savings caps reflect state definitions of disability through the inability to work, as they communicate that people shouldn't be working and drawing benefits at the same time. However, the low level of disability benefits produces an imperative to work. My ethnographic fieldwork shows that people with disabilities need to supplement their benefits with paid work to survive, but they seek and accept marginal jobs to keep their wages below a level which will affect their benefits. For instance, when the local minimum wage went up, some client workers requested cuts to their hours so they could keep their earnings low. The catch-22 of benefits earnings caps thus constitutes disabled people as a precarious labor force. Next, I'll move to a second welfare state manifestation of the contradictory definition of disability through the inability and imperative to work, the conditions attached to disability works contracts with the state. Disability Works gets money from two main agencies: the federally funded Department of Vocational Services, which treats work as imperative and pushes for rapid job placements, and the local Department of Health, which constructs people with disabilities as unable to work and strives to protect them from exploitation. In this next part of the presentation, I'm going to describe some conflicting statements from staff about these contracts, but if you start to get confused, remember that these conflicting logics within Disability Works are exactly what we're interested in. The vocational services contract mandates that Disability Works achieve high numbers of annual job placements. Department of Vocational Services contract goals are set at such a level that in order to meet them, Disability Works must place client workers extremely quickly and, if possible, achieve more than one placement per client worker per year. Client workers moving between temporary jobs can count double towards contract goals. So the best way to achieve these goals is to place people in successive short-term jobs, one after another. And even though federal regulations nominally require placements to be in community-based jobs, Disability Works and a group of similar employment programs banded together to convince the Department of Vocational Services that their segregated, temporary, in-house programs should qualify as legitimate job placements so that they could meet their contract goals. Following this successful lobbying effort, the job placement manager identified Disability Works' temporary in-house programs as responsible for its achievement of contract goals, telling me that rapid placements in external jobs would be much more challenging. Overall, caseworkers thus reported placing between 50 and 80% of client workers in temporary in-house programs. In this excerpt from my field notes, conflict over this strategy emerged in a meeting between Disability Works and the Department of Vocational Services. One vocational services staffer, Alexis, got angry about Disability Works' habit of placing most of their client workers in temporary jobs and argued that these placements shouldn't count toward their contract goals. She described one client worker who was angry that her temporary job had been recorded as a legitimate placement when she still couldn't find a permanent job at the end. But Disability Works staff insisted that they had no other option and that other disability employment programs also rely on temporary placements to meet their goals. Another DVS staffer stepped in to mediate by acknowledging that the state's emphasis on rapid placements incentivized these placements in temporary jobs. As he explained, if we didn't have such large caseloads, and the state capital didn't care so much about if we got placements, I would rather keep cases open, presumably to find better jobs for client workers. But the state capital does want placements. Despite Alexis's critique of this system, the Department of Vocational Services left it in place following this meeting and for the duration of my fieldwork. Meanwhile, the Department of Health contract constructs people with disabilities as unable to work and in need of protection from labor markets. The Department of Health contracts don't require new job placements, but fund in-house work programs and evaluate them based on retention and client workers' responses to surveys about their well-being and professional development. Client workers often told me that they felt more comfortable in these programs than in community-based jobs, as they weren't penalized as much if they missed work or showed symptoms of mental illness, and as these programs offered a lot of therapeutic support. For example, when one client worker had a mental health crisis on the job, her supervisors spent the entire day talking her through this crisis. When she was later hospitalized for suicidal thoughts, they called her regularly to check in. This was much more support than client workers thought they could get in jobs outside of Disability Works, and it reflects the protective orientation of the Department of Health. However, employment in these in-house programs remained precarious, with most contracts ending after 6 to 9 months. Hiring managers in Department of Health funded programs prioritize client workers already known to disability works, seeing their completion of in-house programs as more probable and thus advancing progress towards contract goals. So they shuffled client workers through one temporary in-house job after another, just as the Department of Vocational Services contract incentivized caseworkers to do. Staff provided conflicting explanations for the relationship between case management and the in-house work programs, which can be traced to the divergent aims of these programs' funding agencies, and which ultimately contribute to client worker precarity. Work program supervisors frame their programs as supported employment for people unable to work in competitive jobs, justifying the provision of support mandated by their contract with the state. Meanwhile, caseworkers and managers responsible for the vocational services contract framed in-house programs as competitive employment to enable these placements to be counted toward their own contract goals. Staff responsible for the vocational services contract claimed that enrollment in case management was meant to precede employment in in-house programs, with employment in these programs representing competitive placements, the main vocational services contract expectation. Meanwhile, work program supervisors claimed that enrollment in case management services was meant to follow employment in in-house programs, with enrollment in case management indicating personal growth, the main Department of Health contract expectation. In reality, client workers move back and forth between case management services and in-house work programs and often engaged with both at once, allowing both branches of the organization to claim success on their contract goals. Yet this back and forth destabilized client workers' lives by keeping them in successive temporary jobs rather than in permanent jobs. Alongside benefits earnings caps, contradictions in the contract goal system thus contribute to the production of precarity. We have two examples now of how the contradictory definition of disability through the inability and imperative to work produces people with disabilities as a contingent labor force. Pivoting to my second field site, Autacity is part of an emergent network of autism hiring programs in the tech industry, established between the 2000s and the present day. This industry developed from the stereotype premise of autistic workers as socially awkward geniuses whose work in technical jobs will generate productivity, innovation, and ultimately profits for tech companies. Over the past 2 decades, many Fortune 500 companies established in-house programs to hire and train autistic workers, while others partnered with independent contractors like my field site. This model emerged during a major boom in the tech industry, which necessitated new sources of labor, but has contracted during the industry's more recent stagnation. Informants across the industry characterize major tech companies' claims to hire large numbers of autistic workers as, at best, PR spin, and at worst, outright lies. Several former managers at large tech companies told me that early autistic hires required significant accommodations and quit or were fired when tech companies were unable to support them. For instance, some autistic workers need very regular meetings with their managers to stay on track, which large tech companies aren't prepared to provide. Many applicants to autism hiring programs struggle to complete college or the prestigious internships that tech companies expect to see. As such, one former manager told me that employers realized, quote unquote, the autistic candidate pool that they were going for was too small, end quote. Contrary to stereotypes, there simply are not very many autistic people with savant skills beneficial to their employers, but few to no support needs. As such, my informants report that many of the best-known companies in this field have suspended actual hiring in their autism hiring programs, though they continue to promote these programs in the media. My own challenges in gaining ethnographic access to a program illustrate the low level of autism hiring going on behind the scenes at large companies. I spent a year and a half seeking ethnographic access to one of the Fortune 500 companies promoting their autism hiring programs, but I was stonewalled at every turn by managers reporting hiring freezes. I changed gears to focus ethnographically on contractors like Autacity, when it became clear that these contractors were more commonly the direct employers of autistic technical workers. Fieldwork across this industry and interviews with industry stakeholders show that large technology companies prefer not to hire autistic workers directly due to the perceived costs associated with accommodating them, but to hire them on short-term contracts through organizations such as Audacity. This is an explicit part of Audacity's sales pitch to tech companies, which suggests that contracting with Audacity will produce the PR and productivity benefits of hiring autistic workers, without companies themselves taking on the cost of their accommodations. I heard this sales strategy recommended in conversations among managers at Audacity and witnessed its use during preparation of slide decks for sales meetings. For example, in one water cooler conversation, Audacity's director of operations commented that he'd prefer for Audacity to be known for its high-quality work rather than for its focus on disability, but he was willing to use its disability focus to sell them to prospective clients. Another staff member put on an exaggerated sales voice and said, "People with disabilities, they need lots of accommodations. It can be hard for you to figure out. But listen, we're going to do all the hard work for you." Returning to the central argument of my dissertation, the tech industry has attempted to redefine disability on the basis of productivity, but barriers to employment are definitionally part of disability. Few people who perform just like every other tech worker meet the criteria for an autism diagnosis, because the diagnostic criteria are themselves based on the purported inability to work. Large companies manage these structural contradictions of disability by outsourcing the work of supporting disabled people to organizations like Audacity. But this outsourcing produces precarity, just as disability work's management of contradictions produce precarity. Jobs at a contractor like Audacity are much more precarious and more poorly compensated than jobs at the large tech companies that they partner with. Despite its claims to pay tech salaries, Audacity paid just above minimum wage to its entry-level workers. And these low labor costs are exactly what Audacity is selling. If tech companies were willing to pay tech salaries for the data entry and quality assurance work in which Audacity specializes, they'd hire directly instead of outsourcing these tasks. Additionally, subcontracting produces precarity as the flow of work at Audacity is dependent on the needs of their corporate partners. During tech industry booms, Audacity reports rapid growth, whereas during periods of stagnation, it furloughs or lays off significant numbers of workers. In my 11 months at Audacity, 6 workers were fired or laid off, and about 50 workers were furloughed for periods between a few months and a year due to cuts to their contracts with major tech companies. That's over half the company that spent part of the year unemployed. Even when workers are supposedly permanent, their hours, and therefore their wages, are highly unpredictable, with many workers scheduled for variable hours week to week, depending on the needs of the companies they contract with. The most precariously employed client workers were the ones who were most significantly affected by autism or comorbid conditions. As one longtime manager, who herself was autistic, summarized, "We had someone on staff who couldn't function for a long while because he had such bad misophonia that people laughing would set him off." Misophonia refers to high levels of noise sensitivity and is common among autistic people. Ultimately, we stopped having enough work for him. Most of the people with high support needs are on call at the moment, meaning indefinitely furloughed. It feels like there's some tension, maybe, between Audacity's original mission of employing people and these attempts to make it not profitable exactly, but revenue neutral. Audacity balances the construction of autistic people as highly productive technical geniuses with the reality that many autistic people struggle to work productively in typical environments. It resolves this tension through furloughs, layoffs, and low overall wages. This is our third example of how the contradictory construction of disability through the inability and imperative to work produces disabled workers as a contingent labor force. Disability works and Audacity represent variations on a theme. Although Disability Works presents itself as a social services nonprofit, and Audacity presents itself as a traditional tech company, their labor practices converge. Both employ disabled people in precarious, low-wage jobs in growing industries, respectively, service industries and the tech industry. These precarious conditions weren't lost on client workers at either program. I'll read out this quote from Andrea, a client worker at Disability Works. I got acquainted with the interns of another Disability Works training program, and I got acquainted with the other clerks at Disability Works. And my impression is we're all underemployed. We're all working as clerks and receptionists. I mean, some of us have law degrees. Somebody has an economics degree. I have an architecture degree. There was somebody who was a nurse. See, we're all highly educated people, but for some reason, because of this so-called disability, we're underemployed. There isn't really a promise of a real job. They're dead-end jobs. They're dead-end jobs. I could spend another 40 minutes describing the effects of precarious employment on client workers' lives. Housing insecurity, food insecurity, limited access to healthcare, few to no luxuries, and terror always of the loss of whatever measure of material security client workers had managed to carve out. But given the limited time that we have left, I want to zoom out from my fieldwork and discuss what all of this tells us about disability under capitalism. Convergent labor practices at Audacity and Disability Works demonstrate, first, the contradictory construction of disability, and second, how these contradictions produce disabled people as a labor force capable of filling in gaps in the post-industrial economy. Audacity and Disability Works present themselves totally differently. One is a tech company disrupting traditional employment programming, and one is a social services nonprofit. Yet at both organizations, disability as a category is defined simultaneously by the purported inability to work and the imperative to work. These contradictions produce disabled workers as a contingent labor force suited to the needs of capital. At Disability Works, disability benefits means testing forces people with mental illnesses into low-wage, part-time, and informal work, and contracts with the state incentivize their placement in temporary, segregated jobs. At Audacity, capitalist outsourcing practices maintain autistic workers as an on-call labor force available for work when the tech industry expands and compliant with layoffs when it contracts. This ethnographic comparison reveals how the state and private capital jointly constitute workers with disabilities as a contingent labor force, extending historical materialist work on disability to the present day. Tensions between the inability and imperative to work constitute disabled people as persistently half in, half out of the labor force, drawn in or pushed out as capital requires. In line with broader literatures on surplus labor, this half in, half out status is highly functional for contemporary capitalism. In this talk, I focused on my ethnographic fieldwork rather than my historical research. But in my broader dissertation, I draw on archival data and interviews to theorize the reconstitution of disability as an aspect of neoliberalism. The historical chapters of my dissertation link efforts to integrate disabled people into labor markets to the broader commodification of human labor under neoliberalism. In these chapters, I theorize efforts to make disability profitable as one dimension of corporate and state responses to the crisis of profitability experienced in the second half of the 20th century. I'd be happy to talk more about this historical context from my ethnographic fieldwork in the Q&A. Thank you so much. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and we can talk about any questions you all have.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was so insightful, and we're so appreciative of your time with us. I'm going to give the floor to Karen to do a brief response, after which we will open up the Q&A from the audience.
Thanks so much, Emily, for joining us. I find it quite an incredible study, and particularly as someone who's actually studied the global precarity of disability and its ongoing development as a contingent labour force, as a global phenomenon, not just emerging in the late 70s and with the greater push in the late 80s, but particularly since the global financial crisis of 2007 and 8, and the way in which global institutes such as the OECD have really pushed for this idea of making disability roles much smaller as part of the welfare national GDP, and to really move disabled people out of welfare and into the labour market. And most of those jobs are precarious. And I think one of the key issues that you've really highlighted is while people think about labour market in terms of cash earnings, what they really forget about is the cost of disability in everyday life, thinking about the cost of accessible housing, thinking about the cost of having or needing additional aids, medication, pharmaceuticals, ongoing access to healthcare, home support, and all of those kind of qualifications and entitlements really come through having state access to a disability category. And it's this tension between what are the incentives to propel people into the labour market, and how can states actually come in and support people to maintain well-being of those other aspects of life, living as a disabled person in an ableist discriminatory society, is never addressed in these policies. It's all about rapid attachment to the labour market and cost on the welfare rolls to bring that down. And it is a multiplicity of programs. And most people just think of disability labour market programs, but as you highlighted today, it's social security. It's, in the US case, it's Medicaid, but in other countries, it's about in-home supports, but also access to accommodation supports. Unless you have a disability category, you're unlikely to receive the funding that you require to be able to maintain ongoing labour market and career growth that is required, because employers often get huge subsidies to provide reasonable accommodation. And I think in all of this too, what I find really interesting is the way in which it's not just the convergence of the disability movement globally around this agenda of closing down institutions with conservatives around fiscal costs, but also the way in which the whole idea of reasonable accommodation really undermines disabled people's access to the labour market. And, you know, real structural forms of social mobility that enable them to move class status and to maintain health, well-being, and social connection and intimate parts of their lives that they were denied in institutions. So all of these contradictions really get played out in the broader aspect of their subjectivity and their humanity. So thank you very much. It was a really interesting study, and it's really a great privilege to have you present your emerging work out of your PhD, and it's very exciting to see what you're going to do next building on this work. So thank you. Thank you for joining us. Tarandip,
Thank you so much.
Again, Emily and Karen, for your participation. The CERC team and Angie, our live captioner. Please check out our website for events coming up next year. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.